Good afternoon. My name is Jeff Resnick. I'm the Chief of the History of Medicine Division here at the National Library of Medicine at the National Institutes of Health. Thank you for joining us today, those of you here on the NIH campus at the NLM, and those of you watching remotely, to hear the second annual Michael E. DeBakey Lecture in the History of Medicine, which is part of the NLM's 2018 History of Medicine Lecture Series. I'll introduce our guest lecturer in a moment, but first I'd like to share with you some details about our lecture series and the NLM Michael E. DeBakey Fellowship in the History of Medicine, named in honor of the legendary American surgeon, educator, and medical statesman Michael E. DeBakey. The NLM's History of Medicine lecture series promotes awareness and use of NLM and other historical collections for research, education, and public service in biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. The series also supports the commitment of the NLM to recognize the diversity of its collections, which span 10 centuries, encompass a range of digital and physical formats, and originate from nearly every part of the globe. And of course, also to appreciate the backgrounds of the various disciplines and individuals of various disciplines who value these collections and use them to advance their research, their teaching, and their learning. All of our lectures are free, open to the public, and are live streamed globally and subsequently archived by NIH Videocasting, thanks to a generous gift to the National Library of Medicine from the Michael E. DeBakey Medical Foundation. That gift from the DeBakey Medical Foundation also enabled the NLM to establish the NLM Michael E. DeBakey Fellowship in the History of Medicine and the annual DeBakey Lecture in the History of Medicine, all in honor of Dr. DeBakey's career spanning 75 years, during which his work transformed cardiovascular surgery, raised medical education standards, and informed national healthcare policy. Dr. DeBakey pioneered dozens of operative procedures which routinely save thousands of lives every year, and he performed some of the very first heart transplants. His inventions included the roller pump, a key component of the heart-lung machine, as well as artificial hearts and ventricular assist pumps. He was, of course, a driving force in building Houston's Baylor University College of Medicine into a premier medical center, where he trained several generations of top surgeons from all over the world. Dr. DeBakey was a visionary, a supporter of the National Library of Medicine, and he played a pivotal role in the transformation of the library from the Armed Forces Medical Library in the 1960s, and also in the establishment of the National Network of Libraries of Medicine in the 1960s, and also as well in launching NLM outreach initiatives in the 1990s. He also was key in promoting the digitization of the NLM's indexes to pre-1960 journal articles. During the past 2 years, the NLM Michael E. DeBakey Fellowship in the History of Medicine has enabled 9 selected individuals to complete in-depth research in the Michael E. DeBakey papers held by the National Library of Medicine. This is a collection which encompasses the diverse areas in which DeBakey made his lasting impact. This year, in cooperation with the DeBakey Medical Foundation, in tribute to DeBakey's appreciation of the expanse of the history of medicine, the expanse of his legacy itself, and the expanse of our historical collections themselves, we've opened the fellowship to support research in all of the historical collections held by the National Library of Medicine, including, but not limited to, the DeBakey papers. The application period is open until September 28th of this year, and all the details are available on the NLM's History of Medicine Division website at www.nih.gov/HMD. It's now my pleasure and privilege to introduce Heidi Morefield of Johns Hopkins University, a 2017 NLM DeBakey Fellow, who will deliver our 2018 DeBakey Lecture in the History of Medicine. Ms. Morefield is a doctoral candidate in Hopkins Department of the History of Medicine, where she is working on her dissertation entitled Making Technology Appropriate: Modernization, Health, and Development in the Global Cold War. Broadly speaking, this project examines the history of the appropriate technology movement in foreign health assistance, and it reflects Ms. Morefield's deep research interest in the production, the circulation, and consumption of pharmaceuticals in a global health context, as well as her interest in drug shortages, biomedicine and global health, the history of technology, and the history of capitalism. Prior to starting her graduate work at Hopkins, Ms. Morefield worked as a project manager for a USAID contractor in the Democratic Republic of Congo and in Ghana. She earned her BA in International Development from McGill University and her MSc in Global Health and Public Policy from the University of Edinburgh. Her work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Ford Presidential Foundation, and the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. And during the past year, she's been a graduate fellow at Hopkins Center for Medical Humanities and Social Medicine. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Morefield to the National Library of Medicine to deliver her 2018 Michael E. DeBakey lecture entitled Transplanting Technology, Dr. Michael DeBakey and Cold War Technology Transfer. Heidi.
Thank you all for coming. It is my privilege to be here at the National Library of Medicine, giving a lecture about and named for Dr. Michael DeBakey, especially to an interested group of diverse professional backgrounds. And just before I begin, I want to thank Jeff Resnick and his team here at the NLM, as well as the DeBakey Medical Foundation, for their support through the Michael DeBakey Fellowship in the History of Medicine, which enabled this work. At the height of the Cold War, Dr. Michael Ellis DeBakey, one of the most prolific American surgeons of the 20th century, made several trips to China and the USSR to survey the medical landscape on the other side of the Iron Curtain. He toured clinics and medical schools and met with the barefoot doctors. DeBakey, well known for his invention of the Dacron graft, a left ventricular assist device, and the artificial heart, was, at his core, a technologist. Through his travels, he also became a broker of valuable medical information, teaching new techniques and introducing new machines in the USSR and China, while reporting on the conditions of Chinese and Soviet medical institutions back home to the American public. Dr. DeBakey's public persona loomed large. Through his keen eye for publicity and facility with the media, the world got to know Dr. DeBakey over the course of his over 7 decades-long career. My work is based on DeBakey's extensive personal paper collection found here at the National Library of Medicine, an institution he helped to found. I want to acknowledge at the outset that I haven't had a chance to visit parallel archives in Russia or China. However, my intent here is to take a biographical approach to understanding DeBakey's work, which includes the way he curated his own records and the care he took in creating his public image. While work in his personal papers risks continuing the legacy of great doctors' history, epitomized best perhaps by Dr. Henry Sigrist's famous volume and critiqued in the late 1970s by social historians of medicine Susan Rutherby and David Rosner, archival work of this type often moves in surprising ways. Through this talk, I want to highlight some facets of Dr. DeBakey that are less well known. First, though it's easy to think of Dr. DeBakey as the face of high-tech American surgical interventions, held up as an example of the promises of American science in the Cold War, he was first and foremost impressed with simple, low-tech solutions. This becomes apparent through the study of his Cold War travels in particular. He was fascinated with health systems and technologies developed outside the United States. Second, I'll argue that his diplomatic success was possible in part because of his willingness to take these less high-tech medical systems seriously. He praised the barefoot doctors and was impressed with Russian medical inventions that were showcased during his visits. In other words, DeBakey understood technology as being appropriate only in context. When we think about technology transferred during the Cold War, we tend to think of big projects, hydroelectric dams, factories, and power plants conveyed through state-based international systems. Through his travels, Dr. DeBakey engaged in a smaller scale, much more personal and dynamic form of technology transfer. For him, technology was simultaneously a medium and a message, a site of teaching and of learning. His detailed personal writing and the extensive documentation of his work in the medical and lay press make not only his contributions, but his thinking behind them accessible to historians like myself. And though DeBakey did not theorize explicitly about high and low technology, as a historian, I'm drawing on tools of the history and sociology of technology, such as the work of David Arnold on everyday technology and David Edgerton on the shock of the old, to show how attending to simple, everyday, low technologies opens up important stories about innovation and knowledge-making. Often described in exultant terms, a wizard, the Texas tornado, and most often as a pioneer transcending the frontiers of medicine and surgery, the metaphor works on multiple fronts. He developed new devices and surgical techniques, innovated the use of communications technologies and media for education of both doctors and the lay public, and overcame geographic and political boundaries in his travels. Technology always featured heavily in Dr. DeBakey's work. He prototyped new, more affordable blood transfusion instruments while still in medical residency at Tulane, and innovated numerous significant devices and techniques for cardiac surgery throughout his celebrated career. Even as DeBakey fine-tuned the design of his artificial heart in the early 1960s, he remained focused on heart valve repair. The mechanical heart, Dacron grafts, and plastic blood vessels he invented were framed by many at the time as spare parts for the human machinery of the heart. This analogy suggests that his innovations were themselves in service of a form of maintenance. Rather than focus on heart transplantation, DeBakey invented devices that could be used to repair the patient's own heart where possible. And not all of these rose to the same level of technological complexity as the artificial heart. Some of his earliest breakthroughs were decidedly low-tech. Vinyl resin sprayed on the skin to keep wounds clean during surgery. Ice water to cool the patient's body below normal temperatures in order to keep cells alive without regular blood flow, and plastic cloth blood vessels that he sewed himself after work. The press seemed fascinated not only with DeBakey's techniques, they were thoroughly excited about how ice water saved a man's life, but also with his preference for hands-on practice. At a time when sewing, outside of surgery, was heavily gendered work, Dr. DeBakey took pride in his abilities and opted to make the blood vessels himself, rather than outsource the work, though an article pictured here from 1955 is sure to point out that his mother taught him to sew as a boy and that he used his wife's sewing machine. This tendency to tinker with surgical devices led to some major successes and an influx of celebrity patients, through which DeBakey gained a reputation that spanned the globe. Invitations were soon pouring in from foreign governments and monarchs, asking the famous surgeon to visit, perform some life-saving operations, and in doing so, demonstrate his techniques to their local doctors. The Cold War seemed to have little impact on the nature of these invitations. Dr. DeBakey's status as a preeminent surgeon afforded him a mobility between the East and West that few others enjoyed. He made his first trip to the USSR in December of 1958 to attend the All-Russian Surgical Congress in Leningrad at the invitation of Professor Alexander Vishnevsky, a leading Soviet cardiac surgeon. In addition to the conference, Dr. DeBakey was able to visit several clinics to meet with surgeons and observe their operating technique, including Professor Uglov's clinic at the First Leningrad Medical Institute, the Leningrad Military Academy of Medicine, and the Leningrad Institute of Blood Transfusions. His richly detailed diary entries convey his fascination with the different surgical techniques the Soviet doctors had developed, the very centralized and yet siloed medical system, and the juxtaposition of very fine cultural pursuits, he was a guest at the ballet most evenings, with the starkness of the standard of living for most people. One institute of particular interest to him was the Scientific Research Institute for Experimental Surgical Apparatus and Instruments, which he described as, quote, an unusual, if not unique, institute, concerned primarily with the development of surgical instrumentation. With a staff of 20 physicians, 65 engineers, and 200 other employees, the facility designed and manufactured all types of surgical instruments and had an experimental and clinical wing with 150 patient beds. His assessment of Russian surgery overall was mixed. Many aspects, from the architecture of the old-style operating theaters to the fact that many surgeons still operated in their street clothes, were, he thought, outdated, while the surgeons' techniques were generally strong. The mix of technology was perhaps the most interesting to Dr. DeBakey. He wrote in his diary, quote, "There's a curious and somewhat baffling contrast in the character and quality of some of their surgical equipment. For example, they may have some of the most modern and elaborate equipment, such as color television, 8-channel recording units, vector cardio-oscilloscopes, while at the same time, the operating room lights, operating table, and some of their basic surgical instruments are either old and crude or poorly constructed. This was particularly puzzling given their Special Institute for Surgical Instruments and their demonstrated capacity to manufacture instruments of the highest quality." On return from his second trip to Russia 2 years later, again to attend the annual Surgical Congress, this time in Moscow, he noted that the country had made progress from his prior visit. "The Russian doctors are pretty well along in the basic areas of medicine," he wrote. "They're doing especially good work with blood transfusions and surgery of the stomach and lungs, though the facilities were still, he thought, nowhere near as modern as his clinic in Houston. In cardiovascular surgery in particular, Dr. DeBakey noted the Russians lagged far behind. the heart-lung machine that they had developed, which he saw a prototype of in 1958 and had then assessed as, quote, all wrong, was in 1960 still only being used on dogs. They were therefore eager to learn from his lectures and presentations. Their response was truly heartwarming, he wrote in his diary. At the completion of my presentation, they gave me a rising ovation, and it seemed that the applause would never stop. A major reason for Dr. DeBakey's worldwide renown was his facility with and pioneering use of another non-clinical technology, television. In 1954, sensational headlines announced that DeBakey had shown a beating heart on television as he performed surgery on 44-year-old George Chisholm. And while today we can all probably picture in our mind's eye what that looks like, at the time it was a sight most viewers in the lay public would never have seen before. 10 million see pulsing heart of Texan in dramatic surgery on TV, one headline declared, as the article began like a medical thriller. A beating human heart was laid bare before a nationwide television audience on Sunday, in a real life-and-death drama staged in an operating room and filmed for an audience of 10 million persons. A battery of skilled surgeons performed a delicate heart operation on a Texas oil field worker. Ever the medical statesman, DeBakey did not limit his use of television to the United States. On June 5, 1957, he used closed-circuit television to moderate a panel discussion of heart surgery between New York and London, connecting for the first time the American physicians meeting at the American Medical Association conference in Carnegie Hall with their British counterparts at the Harvey Tercentenary Congress in the Great Hall of the Royal College of Surgeons. He also televised surgeries in Houston and broadcast them to physicians in Europe for training purposes, here pictured to Geneva via the Early Bird satellite in 1966. During an August 1967 trip to Belgrade, Yugoslavia, Dr. DeBakey was keen to use television to educate both doctors and the lay public. While there, he performed 10 heart operations and broadcast the 9th live to 3 million viewers on Yugoslav television, believed to be the first live operation on television in Europe. The 1-hour, 25-minute surgery was then rebroadcast in Italy, France, Norway, and Finland. DeBakey saw television as a way not only of promoting his new surgical techniques, but of educating the public about the possibilities and promises medicine held. For Dr. DeBakey, science was humanitarianism. His travels informed his strong belief in and advocacy for increased foreign medical aid in spite of the Cold War tensions such aid to countries like Yugoslavia would represent. On his last day in Belgrade, he proposed a large-scale program to share American medicine with the world, by sending leading doctors abroad to lecture and perform operations, and by spending more money to provide modern equipment and facilities for countries that could not afford them. I've had to pay for all of this myself, he said, referring to his travel costs as well as those of his 8 assistants, and the 3,000 pounds of medical equipment he brought with him. If we could have more of this kind of thing, it would be far better in terms of impact than almost any kind of program I could think of. In another interview immediately after his return, DeBakey again urged the American government to do more in terms of foreign medical aid, citing a limit to what the private sector could provide, as well as the impact of medical aid in particular. U.S. Embassy officials in Yugoslavia had apparently told him that the trip had had, quote, more impact on Yugoslav-U.S. relations than any other event in recent years, which DeBakey attributed to medicine's unique humanitarianism, what he described as, quote, an approach to foreign relations which touches people individually, not just their governments. His proposal came at a moment in which humanitarian intervention was a daily concern of the American publics, who watched the Biafran War unfold and thousands of children starve to death on the nightly news. Later scholars would identify the Biafran crisis as the beginning of modern notions of humanitarianism, as Michael Ignatieff put it, the age of televised disaster. With the rise of new organizations like Médecins Sans Frontières, this new humanitarianism departed from the morally and politically neutral humanitarianism negotiated in the previous 100 years by the Red Cross. Critics, such as policy analyst David Reef, have argued that it does more harm than good through overreach and hubris. Yet in 1967, humanitarianism held an idealistic appeal for Dr. DeBakey. Some have called the sincerity of his belief into question, citing his business partnerships and commercial pursuits. And though we tend to think of humanitarianism as altruistic and not for profit, as I found in my larger dissertation project on appropriate technology, health technologies intended for humanitarian endeavors often operated according to a capitalist logic. DeBakey's belief in humanitarianism and his business acumen therefore were not at odds, but rather facilitated one another. The profits he brought in could be used to finance travel and bring medical technology to less wealthy parts of the world. In the early 1970s, Dr. DeBakey was able to cross another geographic and political frontier. He was one of the first Americans to visit Cold War China after the U.S. reopened diplomatic relations with the communist power in 1972. His visit in February 1973 was under the auspices of the China Medical Association. It was his third invitation to the country. The first two were in 1961 and 62, though the first time the State Department had allowed him to travel. While there, DeBakey kept a detailed travel diary documenting his observations on everything from Chinese health and medicine to the countryside to the quality of the tea. He praised China's, quote, Spartan society and the good medicine that was performed with what he called stark simplicity. In particular, he was impressed with the Chinese surgeons' treatment of trauma victims, including severe burns and limb reimplants, and the use of acupuncture anesthesia. Though a colleague of mine who specializes in East Asian medicine likened these types of high-profile organized tours to those of Potemkin villages, DeBakey seemed to take them seriously, if with a critical eye. His praise of simple technology, while it contrasted sharply with the high-tech setup he had at home in his clinic at Baylor, was characteristic of his approach. While he was capable of designing and executing highly complex operations, throughout his career he admired simple solutions that would be accessible to most people. In an oral history interview with American journalist Don Shanch, he elaborated on what he thought not only of Chinese medical systems, but also of the society itself. In his questions, Shanch positioned China as an undeveloped country, a, quote, primitive state, which Dr. DeBakey vehemently refuted, in part by citing Chinese technological advances. You know, they discovered paper, they discovered dynamite, they had a pretty high, sophisticated understanding of astronomy, mathematics, and so on. So it's no undeveloped country. It simply is not developed industrially until recently, he said. He went on to describe his meeting with a barefoot doctor, a young girl of about 26, not actually barefoot, he had to clarify, who helped many patients with basic ailments through the use of herbal medicine, but who had also been trained to perform appendectomies and took pride in the fact that she had successfully done about 30 operations. The medical system worked well, he thought. The barefoot doctors could always refer more complicated cases up to middle doctors from the aid stations, and from there to larger city hospitals. In spite of Dr. DeBakey's positive depiction, Shanch's questions continually focused on what he assumed were downsides of the communist regime. A characteristic exchange went, Shanch, did the children that greeted you look malnourished? DeBakey, no. Shanch, did you have to bring your own equipment for your lectures? DeBakey, no, they had all the equipment. Shanch, did you worry about getting too sophisticated? DeBakey, no. Shanch, did the doctors you lectured to ask informed questions? DeBakey, yes, they were informed, he said. They were good doctors. They were mostly interested, DeBakey said, in techniques and technologies they were not already using in China. As a gift, he had brought with him a heart-lung machine, some Dacron grafts, and replacement heart valves. Extra pieces for the heart-lung machine were shipped separately so that the machine could be maintained. His attention to spare parts and long-term use were uncharacteristic of American aid operations at the time, and point to the sincerity of his intention that the gifts helped to develop new capacities in Chinese surgery. Dr. DeBakey was confident that the Chinese surgeons he met, which he judged as technically very good, would put the gifts to good use. Dr. DeBakey, in turn, was fascinated with some of the Chinese technology he encountered, in particular, in this interview, thermoses. They have a nice thing that they do, sort of a custom, he said. They have these large thermos jugs, and they really do work beautifully. I mean, for example, every morning they'd bring me one in my room at the hotel, and that damned thing, the water was steaming hot, and the morning after, it was still steaming hot. Shanch. They'd conquered the thermos bottle. DeBakey. It really is beautiful, really. Shanch. The thermos gap. DeBakey. That thermos is one of the... Everybody commented about how efficient it was. I'd like to take some of them home. And while one might read these comments about the Chinese thermoses as tongue-in-cheek or even mocking, they're actually very characteristic of DeBakey's interest in technologies of all different scales. Moreover, small-scale gifts, as the social science on pharmaceutical advertising through the gifting of pens and clipboards to physicians has shown, are often a greater value than high-cost items that are less of an everyday presence in the clinic. Dr. DeBakey remembered those thermoses, symbols of the potential of Chinese innovation, as they were an everyday gift in his hotel room. On his return home, Dr. DeBakey wrote to President Nixon. "My dear Mr. President," he wrote, "I have just returned from a 2-week visit to the People's Republic of China, where I was the guest of the Minister of Health and the China Medical Association. In my many visits to various countries of the world, I have never experienced a more cordial reception or been accorded warmer hospitality. There can be no question that your historic visit to China initiated this new climate of warm friendship with America and the sincere desire for improving and strengthening our interchange. In this connection, I believe that the medical bond of interchange constitutes one of the strongest mechanisms for improving international relations." Dr. DeBakey again framed medicine as a form of moral humanitarianism and suggested further medical cooperation between the US and China and the USSR as a means of generating world peace and what he called constructive developments for mankind. President Nixon seemed unconvinced, but thanked the doctor for conveying his views. In the epilogue to his travel diary, which he published a year later, Dr. DeBakey wrote that, quote, "My visit to China, albeit brief, was truly one of the most memorable and exciting experiences I've ever had in my extensive travels to foreign lands around the world. The organization of the Chinese healthcare system, the way in which it was implemented within a short time, despite the shattering social upheaval that occurred during the Cultural Revolution, and the extraordinary results they've achieved with limited resources are indeed a magnificent tribute to the dedication of the Chinese medical leaders and to the altruism and industry of the health workers. It is an inspiration to see the devotion and compassion with which all levels of medical personnel attend to the health needs of the masses." Though he certainly was no communist, he nevertheless respected the Chinese health system for its accessibility to all people. He extended invitations to Dr. Wu Qieping of the China Medical Association and to Dr. Cheng Shuxi of the orthopedic department at Peking Qishuitan Hospital to visit his clinic at Baylor and to exchange trainees, which they gratefully acknowledged. Dr. Cheng Shuxi wrote to Dr. DeBakey, quote, "You have certainly praised our work very much, but we are afraid that we may not deserve the praise. However, we will do our best to render better service to the working people in the years to come." He thanked Dr. DeBakey for inviting him and his colleagues to Houston, indicating, quote, "We will do so whenever there is a chance, for we do believe that exchanging of experiences is always beneficial to our work." And though I have not been able to trace students from this particular clinic, Dr. DeBakey welcomed dozens of foreign medical students to Houston as trainees over the course of his career, many of whom did come from China. In 1972 and 73, Dr. DeBakey also made 2 more trips to Moscow, first to operate on the chief academician of the USSR's Academy of Sciences, Mstislav Keldysh, and the next year to give the inaugural lecture for the All-Russian Congress of Cardiology. There, he toured the Research Institute of Clinical and Experimental Surgery, which was founded by the academician B.V. Petrovsky in 1963. Dr. DeBakey was there presented with a gleaming brochure showcasing the technology that had been developed at the Institute, clearly meant to impress. These included an organ storage unit produced in 1965, an intrapericardial artificial heart with a pneumatic gear, and electroconductive vascular grafts with silver frames. Though many of these technologies bore substantial similarities to Dr. DeBakey's own inventions, and to be clear, he never mapped the distinction between low and high technology onto the East-West divide, the Soviet delegation showing the doctor around Moscow nevertheless positioned their own technology in cardiac surgery as far behind that of the United States, and therefore made the claim that the USSR was in need of technology transfer. Though his communications with and travels to the USSR and China at the height of the Cold War had landed him at the top of President Nixon's master list of academic enemies, Dr. DeBakey nevertheless wrote to the president again upon his return to praise his meeting with Mr. Brezhnev and to offer the Russian perspective on it. "My dear Mr. President," he wrote again, "it was truly a heartwarming experience to hear, repeatedly, their impassioned sentiments about the signal importance of this meeting and its highly salubrious implications." DeBakey's letters to the president, while very flattering, often fell into a Socratic pattern wherein he attempted to lead Nixon toward what he thought was a more moral, humanitarian view of the world. The 2 men, Dr. DeBakey and President Nixon, met a few days later in San Clemente. Dr. DeBakey proposed improving cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union in health and medicine, including the exchange of trainees and scientists and the establishment of a collaborative program in the field of cardiovascular artificial devices and instrumentation, which the Soviet minister indicated was needed because of what he called the Americans' greatly advanced technology. DeBakey saw this collaboration as a humanitarian endeavor and a means of fostering international alliances. The in-person meetings seemed to have worked. President Nixon was open to the idea. He wrote to Dr. DeBakey after the meeting to say that he had asked his associate director of his domestic council to develop the program. On the Soviet side, Dr. DeBakey's travels were extraordinarily well received. In Pravda, the official newspaper of the Communist Party, Professor E.I. Chazov of the USSR's Academy of Medicine said in an interview that Keldish's surgery was a good example of medical cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States. He wrote, "It became obvious that he needed immediate surgical intervention to repair cardiac vessels. The Soviet surgeons have good experience in treating such diseases. However, we unanimously recognized the wisdom of turning for help to Professor Michael DeBakey, one of the fathers of contemporary cardiac surgery, who has had the greatest experience in the world conducting such operations." Yet the remarkable American surgeon immediately responded to our plea and left his hospital in Houston and flew to Moscow with his assistant, Dr. Noon, and his surgical nurse, Mrs. Morris. This was a very complicated operation. It continued for 6.5 hours and required a great deal of concentration on the part of all participants. But all of us present who participated understood each other with half words. Dr. DeBakey pointed out that while the Soviet and American cosmonauts would work together in 1975, physicians in the two countries were already showing concrete examples of working together. DeBakey's second trip to China was in 1979. Some things had not changed. One of the first notes he made in his travel diary upon arrival, referencing the thermoses, was, quote, "Hot boiling water supplied every day for tea. Stays hot all day." On his second trip, however, he had the opportunity to tour the Fuwai Hospital and observe some surgeries with Dr. Wu. He described, and I'm going to quote the full diary entry here, "First case, open heart surgery with acupuncture, 4 needles, 2 in shoulder and 2 in elbows. Patient had 5 milligrams of Demerol before surgery, but was awake and talking. Second case, under anesthesia, valve, operating room old, ill-equipped, equipment antiquated. Hospital, 320 beds vascular, toured wards, 40 patients per ward. Wards contain 4-bed cubicles, 2-bed cubicles, and 2 one-bed cubicles. Old beds, pans under beds, no AC. Some AC in 4 operating rooms. Some OR windows open. Hospital dark, kept hall lights off. Patients have 1 large bath and restroom per 40 beds. Have 3-bed recovery room, 8-bed intensive care with monitoring for 4 beds. 3-channel Siemens. Hospital fairly clean, but smelled of disinfectant. Open heart surgery patient stays 30 days. Government pays approximately 50%, and industry approximately 50%. Very cheap, $1 per day for food per patient. Nuclear cardio looked good." The abruptness of his description of the clinic contrasts sharply with the lengthy descriptive prose he uses to describe his more leisurely cultural pursuits during the trip. The rest of his diary is filled with rich accounts of his visits to notable tourist attractions, details about the history of the cities he was visiting, and the quality of his meals. These notes were the only part of the diary from this trip that dealt with medicine. They give the impression of having been jotted down quickly, while working, an effort to collect data and statistics on the hospital while also closely observing the techniques of his Chinese colleagues. They also have a strong technological focus. There are 2 brief notes on the patient cases he observed, but the remainder of the diary entry describes the facilities, the number of beds, the smell of disinfectant, and the technology on offer, the state of the equipment, the lights, the 3-channel Siemens electrocardiogram machine. The notes are not as laudatory as his remarks on the barefoot doctors from his earlier trip to China in 1973. This is perhaps because, with the greater familiarity he developed with his Chinese hosts on his first trip, he was trusted to see more of the actual operations of the hospital in 1979. With blunt language, Dr. DeBakey describes the operating room as old and ill-equipped, with antiquated instruments. Nevertheless, he still seemed impressed by the clinic's accessibility and low cost. He maintained that medicine, even high-tech cardiac surgeries, should be available to all. This personal mandate to treat anyone sometimes landed Dr. DeBakey as a mediator of geopolitical tensions amidst the ongoing Cold War. In early January of 1980, Dr. DeBakey was called back to Yugoslavia, this time to attend to its ailing president, Marshal Josip Broz Tito. Also called in was Soviet cardiac specialist Dr. Murat Knyazhev. Yugoslavia at the time was communist but not aligned, and the strongman preferred to keep, as one paper put it, a foot in each camp. The two doctors joined Tito's team of doctors to consult about what to do about the leader's weakening blood vessels, sometimes reported as varicose veins, which impeded the circulation of blood in his legs. The French press reported on the rumors swirling around the controversial Yugoslav leader, that he had been a diabetic for years and had sciatic pain that sometimes made him walk with a limp. The Yugoslav authorities, meanwhile, maintained that all was well and that DeBakey and Knyazhev had been called in out of an abundance of caution. They published a photo, republished here in the French press, of Tito having an animated dinner with DeBakey and Knyazhev, hoping to allay concerns over the health of the leader. Leaders in the West feared that if Tito died, it would lead to a Soviet invasion of Yugoslavia, as they had just done in Afghanistan. However, during their visit, DeBakey and Knyazhev determined that Tito likely did not need surgery at that point, and they went home, though his condition declined rapidly. A week later, Tito's Slovenian cardiac surgeon, Miro Kosak, attempted and failed to put a portion of artificial artery in his left leg, and he soon required a leg amputation, which took place on January 20th. His health continued to worsen, and Tito died on May 4th, 1980. Although DeBakey never operated on President Tito, his presence in Yugoslavia, working alongside his Soviet counterpart Knyazhev, helped to maintain a balance of power between the East and the West, at least for a time. A few months later, Dr. DeBakey was called in to remove the enlarged spleen of the deposed Shah of Iran, who had been exiled from his country. The operation, which eventually took place in March 1980 in Cairo, was controversial not only because of the high-profile patient, but also because it had initially been scheduled to take place in Panama. Dr. DeBakey, after an initial visit, did not consider the facilities there to be adequate, and there was pushback from Panamanian surgeons over DeBakey's role in the surgery, which they felt they should control. His objections to the Panamanian facility, the Paitilla Medical Center, centered around its small size and his lack of confidence in the medical equipment or backup staff. The nearest blood transfusion machine was 35 to 40 miles away at Gorgas Hospital, which was in the U.S. military and canal zone. Transferring there would have risked the exiled Shah not being allowed back into Panama. Although Panamanian surgeons were offended, the surgery was rescheduled and moved to Egypt. Many American news outlets questioned DeBakey's involvement. Why call in a famous cardiac surgeon to remove a spleen? Why upset diplomatic relations with Panama and add to the already tense relationship with revolutionary Iran? DeBakey, however, explained that he would treat anyone, even Ayatollah Khomeini, if he'd requested it. On May 28, 1985, the most recent issue of Medical World News arrived at Dr. DeBakey's clinic. The featured story, Artificial Hearts, An Uneasy Marriage of Machinery and Flesh, detailed the ongoing struggle many cardiac surgeons were having with artificial heart technologies and the ethical dilemmas they presented. 20 years on from DeBakey's work with early iterations of the artificial heart and left ventricular assist device, the article framed the effort as continued, quote, tinkering that was ethically questionable given the allocation of resources for a limited patient population. Moreover, the medical use of cyclosporin to prevent rejection, which began in earnest in 1983, meant that heart transplantation had seen increasing success. Though Dr. DeBakey was not interviewed for the article, he continued to see promise in the artificial heart technology and, especially given the limited donor pool for heart transplants, much value in focusing on maintenance and repair of the patient's existing heart. He continued to develop the ventricular assist device technology well into the 1990s and early 2000s in partnership with the National Aeronautic and Space Agency, NASA, and his colleague at Baylor, Dr. George Noon. The DeBakey Noon ventricular assist device, a miniature long-term implantable device rather than a simple bridge to transplant, as my colleague Andrew Simpson has written about, went on to be licensed to Micromed Technologies and created a new market for these small-scale, though certainly not low-tech, devices. The first implant, in Berlin in November of 1998, and the European clinical trial preceded use in the United States by 4 years. The NASA project to develop a non-pulsatile pump also came after decades of collaboration with scientists and clinicians in the USSR through the US-USSR Joint Artificial Heart Program set up under his advice to President Nixon. During the last 21 years, DeBakey wrote in 1993, The relationship between the US and the USSR in general has not been harmonious. Fortunately, during these 20 years, we scientists and clinicians devoting our life to the betterment of mankind have been working harmoniously together towards the common goal of treating end-stage heart diseases by utilizing the most advanced engineering and scientific technologies. Technology entwined with diplomacy in Dr. DeBakey's vision of a better world. Through his many travels, Dr. DeBakey became so trusted in the East that years later, when one of DeBakey's Russian disciples, Rinat Akhturin, was faced with treating the ailing president of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, he called DeBakey in for assistance with a multiple bypass operation. A friend and founder of the University of Missouri-Kansas City School of Medicine, Dr. E. Gray Diamond, described him as a, quote, sensitive international citizen, a combination of a Yankee in King Arthur's court and an airborne Marco Polo. DeBakey's feats in cardiac surgery are well known, often through hagiographic portrayals. Less well known is that in his role as both a medical statesman and a technologist, DeBakey also pushed geographic, political, and more mundane technical boundaries in pursuit of his vision of a world made more peaceful and human lives made more fulfilling through medicine. His pioneering use of technology facilitated his privileged mobility, both as the impetus for many of his visits and lectures, and with telecommunications as a means of reaching surgeons and the lay public across the globe. His lectures, demonstrations, and gifts of medical technologies, and the network of cardiac surgeons he developed within the communist sphere of influence, served not only to spread advances in the field, but also to foster sincere links of friendship and intellectual camaraderie between two worlds otherwise at war. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Heidi. That was a wonderful talk. I really I learned a lot, and I appreciate it. And before I ask my question, I will just remind the audience, anybody else who's asking questions, please be sure to use the button on the microphone so that it gets recorded for the video cast. So my question is, clearly you've demonstrated that DeBakey was a medical ambassador of the First Order, reaching populations that others in the United States had no access to. He did all of this as a private citizen, essentially. Mm-hmm. Did you encounter, as you were looking through the DeBakey papers, were there any efforts on the part of the government to make him a more formal representative of the U.S. as he was traveling abroad? Did he resist that and think that he would do better work as a private citizen?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. DeBakey was more friendly with certain administrations than others. So he and Nixon, though friendly in San Clemente, kind of butted heads over a lot of the foreign medical aid, though he was able to convince him to start the US-USSR joint program for the artificial heart. On the part of the US government, they kind of maintained an arm's distance from DeBakey, and I think DeBakey also preferred to not be a mouthpiece, to have his own say and be more of an advisor to presidents and administrations than a representative of them. So he also maintained his own distance. But DeBakey was in conversation with the Johnson administration about increasing foreign medical aid, but I haven't seen any evidence that much came from those conversations.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thanks very much for your talk. I have two questions that are basically unrelated, so I'll ask them and you can answer them in whatever order you want. The first one is about his efforts to use television to broadcast surgeries, and I'm just wondering if you can talk at all about the reception of that. I'm thinking now about how much kind of, pearl clutching there is around like people watching surgeries and forensic technology on television, and if that was something at all that he needed to justify to people as he was traveling and doing this, either at home or abroad. And then my second question is if you could talk a little bit more about how DeBakey's efforts contrasted with other efforts to have American medicine in Russia. I'm thinking, for example, of like polio vaccine trials or those kinds of things, which I'm sure are fundamentally different. But if you could maybe talk a little bit more about how he positioned himself vis-a-vis those efforts, that'd be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So the reception to the filming of surgeries and broadcasting on television really varied a lot. I think in the 1950s and 60s in the States, a lot of it was very thrilling and new, though they did make efforts to, for example, not show the patient's head and face in the shot of the surgery. Abroad, it was also a mixed reaction. So in Belgrade, this operation was broadcast live, but in more rural parts of Yugoslavia, they actually embargoed the surgery for about 10 days over concerns about the patient's privacy and whether it was too much for viewers to see. They did eventually broadcast it, but again, they blurred the patient's face and didn't reference the patient's identity, which actually was in contrast to the States. They did release the name of the patient in news articles. And then as for contrast with other medical efforts, particularly things like polio eradication or the smallpox vaccine efforts, DeBakey didn't really comment so much on the kind of primary healthcare techniques or the disease campaigns of the time. His focus really was on access to technology, and particularly that for cardiac surgery. And he also preferred, as I said before, just to maintain a bit of an arm's distance from these kind of state-based or transnational type of efforts. He really did like to be the authority in the room and an advisor capacity rather than someone in the kind of trenches of the diplomatic apparatus.
So Heidi, an excellent talk. Tell us more about the trajectory of your research, how this chapter, if you will, fits in your overall dissertation that we heard about at the introduction.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So DeBakey was relatively unique at the time, especially through the 1970s, in advocating for access to these high-tech surgeries. The appropriate technology movement, which coincided with a lot of these developments, it began really in earnest in 1973 in the United States and was a matter of U.S. policy under USAID, really viewed these types of high-tech medical interventions as inappropriate. It's too high-tech for the developing world. And DeBakey was a voice against that and made all kinds of efforts to make those surgeries available and accessible. There was a geographic distribution to his work as well. I don't know that he visited sub-Saharan Africa, for example, but he certainly traveled widely, and his work was very influential, especially among leading surgeons of the day. And those the ramifications of his work definitely had strong legacies, especially into the 1980s, and you get towards the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and people saying as policy that certain interventions were not appropriate or accessible, or shouldn't be accessible, to most of the developing world. Yes.
Could you possibly discuss the relationship between DeBakey and Christian Barnard and Denton Cooley? Were they existing at the same time and involved in sort of cardiac transplantation and artificial heart formation?
They were. I think it's a very complicated set of relationships to describe, and they changed quite a bit over time. At first, DeBakey and Dr. Denton Cooley were quite close in a kind of mentorship relationship, and they became quite harsh rivals over time. And I think DeBakey's perspective on a lot of the transplantation that was going on with Dr. Christian Barnard in South Africa was that the technology wasn't quite ready yet, according to his view of the matter, and that going ahead with those surgeries when they weren't fully developed and weren't quite ready was really risky and not very responsible, especially to the patients. That was his stance on it, but it's a very, very complex set of relationships over time.
Thank you very much, Heidi, and all the best to you as you continue on with your research. Thrilled to support you, and we wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you very much.